So you guys are my guinea pigs tonight. We got a whole new talk. And I think it's going to be an interesting story for you. It's going to talk a little bit about some American rose industry history, some rose hybridizing history in the United States, and how one little quirky seedling found its way back into breeding. So we're going to travel in time first. We're going to go back to 1953. And little did Marilyn know that she was going to have a rose named for her at that point. I was around. I wasn't interested in roses per se. I was more interested in making sure Mom was close by at that point. But Marilyn obviously might have had some interest, and I thought this was kind of fun. It's funny how things come around again, isn't it? But in 1953, this guy, or these two guys, were the All-America winners. The relatively forgettable Ma Perkins, and then the totally unforgettable Chrysler Imperial. So that sort of sets the style of rose that people were thinking about then. But there was Herb Schwemm. And Herb Schwemm, in my mind, is the great American rose breeder. If you're not familiar with his work, let's just name a few, like Mr. Lincoln and Double Delight and Angel Face and some great Sutter's Gold, fabulous varieties, Joseph's Coat that he's holding there. I wish I had a picture of Herb at that time in his life, but it was tough to find any photos of people that were involved in the industry at that point. And Herb wasn't really thinking about the likes of Ma Perkins and Chrysler Imperial at that time. He was in its 13th year at Armstrong Nurseries. He had started working at Armstrong in a completely different department when they hired Walter Lammerts, Dr. Walter Lammerts, to come in and begin the rose breeding program. And he assisted Dr. Lammerts. And then when Walter left to go back to the university setting and also to Descanso Gardens, then Herb became the main breeder for Armstrong roses. And something had caught his attention that year, and it was a little rose called Rosa Soulieana. And I don't know why, but he was obviously thinking about shrub breeding. And shrub breeding was a wild concept in 1953. Nothing like that had really come to mind for any of the rose breeders. And nowadays they're common. I don't know what got his attention on the variety, if it was like the cinnamon fragrance on it. I more than likely think it was because of the large pyramid-shaped clusters on the variety. And it had distinctive foliage that caught his eye as well. It was probably good disease resistance for the day, but it was once blooming, and it was big. It was a big, rampant plant. But he brought it into the breeding house in 1953, and he dabbled with it. And in 1955, he left Armstrong. So he left an unfulfilled dream. Now, David Armstrong came on as the breeder for Armstrong in 55, and he continued to dabble with some of the seedlings from that Rosa Soulieana work, but nothing ever happened. In 1955, Herb left Armstrong Nurseries because he was frustrated that he found himself doing more administrative work than he was out in the roses or out with the people and the plants. And he formed a partnership with Ole Weeks of Weeks Wholesale Rose Growers, and they began an active pollinating program really concentrating on hybrid teas. And the second year that he was there was when they made the cross that then resulted in Mr. Lincoln. So that's not too bad to start that on your second year of breeding with a firm. Now, Herb suffered some with heart conditions. He was one of the early open heart surgery patients, in fact, and that's what eventually took him from us, but it plagued him along the way. And he and Ole worked together for about 9 years, which is about 8 years longer than most people who worked with Ole lasted. He was a cantankerous sort, to speak of. But he and Herb did pretty well together and created some fantastic hybrids. Angel Face came along soon, as well as so many others. And he left that partnership in 1967. Now, in 67, David Armstrong decided to leave Armstrong and go back to school to get his work in his PhD in psychology, I think it was, or psychiatry, completely unrelated to roses. so Herb was convinced to come back to Armstrong and start the breeding program again and select the breeder to replace him along the way. So that was 67. And that very first year he made a cross that you'll see the results of in just a minute. But we're skipping to 1970, where things have changed up a bit. A little bit better graphics on the Playboy magazine. Don't have Russia, but we do have Frankenstein, at least. And that was the All-America winner that year, first prize. The one and only All-America winner for the season. Still an impactful rose in today's gardens. But Herb was still frustrated because he remembered that work with Soulieana, and he wanted to go back to it. So he brought Soulieana back in the greenhouse, in the breeding house again, and he crossed it with a few things, one of them being Europeana. And that was the one that was successful. Rosa Soulieana was the female, Europeana was the male. Now that very same year he hired this guy, Jack Christensen, to be his assistant. And that seedling I told you about from 67 that he pollinated, it flowered that year, and you might recognize it there. Double delight. So the very first year he was back at Armstrong, he made the cross that yielded double delight. Ole actually accused him of stealing it from their work and taking it to Armstrong, being the kind sort that he was. Now Jack was a young breeder then and very enthusiastic, but Herb had already made his crosses for that year, and he observed them. So we're talking about 1972 or 73, they saw the results of this Rosa Soulieana Europeana cross in the field for the first time. Now unfortunately, we don't have any photos of that, and you might want to cry about it, that's up to you. But we do know it was a pink blend single, so it was a true cross. That it still had the large pyramidal clusters, which were of interest. It still had the clean foliage, which was great, but it was still once blooming. And it was also still pretty darn big, too. But it captures Jack's attention. And in 1974, he brought it into the greenhouse and used it both as a male and female on some different candidates. And turns out it wasn't really very good parent. It was tough to get pollen from, it was tough to get seed from, and the only seed that came forward that it was a true cross was with it as a male and Zarina as the female. Now again, no picture, and I won't subject you to the crying thing again, but we know it was a pink blend semi-double. Again, it had the large clusters, again pretty good clean foliage. It did have some rebloom, and it was slightly more contained in its habit. So we were making advances each time, getting a little bit more petalage, a little bit more rebloom, a little bit tidier habit in the garden, and still keeping the important characteristics that we wanted. Now when that came into the breeding house, because both Herb and Jack were strictly trained against single petal roses. They would reject all single petal roses in their seedlings. But they would still recognize that some might have breeding value. So in 79, Jack brought in this now Zarina seedling and crossed it again with a multitude of different types, some of them here. One of them was also Ole, and there were a couple of unnamed seedlings that were used as well in that cross. And that sort of sets the stage, because every so often you come to a part of a story that illustration just doesn't work. So we have to go back to old-fashioned techniques. So just watch this for a while. So early in 1979, that same year, Jack invited me to leave my job as Bill Warner's assistant at Jackson & Perkins Company and to join him as the Armstrong assistant hybridizer. It was an amazing opportunity for me to get to work with this guy. He's so talented, and also to get to know Herb Schwimm. Even though Herb was retired, he would often come visit us and come look at the seedling house. My program was more about greenhouse roses at that point, and Herb had dabbled in greenhouse roses, but he was very giving of his knowledge. As I told you, Jack had designated his crosses already. for that year, and they were prolific. They set seed beautifully. They gave pollen well. We had quite a lot of them. And 2 years later, when survivors of those 1979 crosses came to flower in the field, to me it was a sight to behold. Their great-great-grandmother's huge clusters of lower petal flowers had come through in almost all of the babies. The unusually pigmented foliage held strong. It had like a deep red picotee around the edge of the leaf. And that may have come from the Europeana bloodline. Most of them were climber-like, but a few were more compact. Most of them were repeat bloomers, some more successful than others. Best of all, there were all sorts of colors. So there were some darker, almost reds, some corals, a lot of pink blends, a few whites, and 2 yellows out of the Sunsprite cross. I'd never seen anything like that group. I was just head over heels and thought it was fantastic and was probably just bugging the heck out of Jack at that point, going, look, 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 look. But I was young and idealistic, and my commercial eye was still in training. I was completely sure that there was something that would have to emerge from that breeding work immediately, and I was wrong. Nothing came forward. In fact, I don't think anything came forward from that 1979 breeding year, so that happens ever so often. At that time, there was a great local society called the San Gabriel Valley Rose and Horticultural Society. And they were a very active group with a broad interest. In the fall of 1982, they were sponsoring a talk by a guy named Clara Martin, who was the new curator of the Rose Garden at the Huntington. And Clara was going to give a talk on shrubs, which was still a pretty new topic. And of course, he was going to talk about the Austin roses, which were also new. I was so excited by the blooms of these shrub seedlings that were in the field, I went out and gathered a bouquet of different colors to take them in for show and tell. At the society, it was a colorful mass of huge hydrangea head-like clusters. To me, it meant exactly what a shrub rose should be: gobs of flowers, lovely clean foliage, and a more relaxed habit for the garden. There was a great member of that society. Her name was Julia Sudol, and she was a character. She was a little thing, but she was kind of a Polish Catholic spitball of a person who often spoke her mind, sometimes using the language of a sailor. But she was devoted to her church despite her language, and she would handcraft these amazing potpourri jars where she would dry whole buds of tiny roses and spiral them around the edge of the container. It was a phenomenal feat, and we were all amazed. At the end of Clara's talk, I was hovering over the bouquet of babies, attempting to answer any questions, and the crowd had begun to dissipate, so I started to wrap up the bouquet for my trip home. And that's when Julia sidled up next to me, stepping on my toes, working her ways. In her very Julia style, she convinced me that she had to have a cutting of one of those yellow seedlings because she didn't have a good yellow, and those buds would be just perfect for her craft project. Realizing that no was not a possible answer, I gave her a cutting on the promise that she would never give it to anybody else. Now we're going to skip forward 4 years, and within those next 4 years, Armstrong Nursery got swallowed up by the corporate world. And it disappeared. I left Armstrong of my own volition for an 11-month vacation. And it still breaks my heart to think of the varieties that we lost. We had beautiful things in the seedling bench, beautiful yellows, stripes, all kinds of things that were right there on the edge, and we had to walk away from them. And that was in 1986. So during 1987, the first year I was at Weeks, we were actually going to be moving. So there was no need to start a breeding program since we were going to be changing properties. So I served as the California sales rep that year and for the following year, and that was really one of the best educational things that could have happened to me, to get out to the customers and see what they really wanted and what they really could sell and what they wanted to see. And I was beginning to work the circuit of rose societies, talking about what's happening and changing at Weeks because it had changed hands. And sure enough, one night at the Pacific Rose Society, there was Julia in the crowd. So she always gave me great hugs, and then she kind of pulled me down by the ear and said, "That blankety blank yellow thing is eating me out of house and home." Yeah, I was thinking for a minute, what blankety blank yellow thing are you talking about? And then suddenly it hit me, it was that seedling. It was that seedling that I gave her the cutting of, and she had it, and it was huge, a huge monster in the back of her property. So I immediately ran over to her garden. We collected budwood. I shared it with Jack. We brought it into our breeding line, and this almost lost rose then made its way back in to the bloodline of today's rose. A few years later, a second seedling was found, and this is one that Jack had sent to France for evaluation. It was a more tidy kind of pink blend seedling. We did some breeding work. I think one seedling came forward out of that, but nothing like this. So let's look at our finished seedling. There's the full genealogy with Rosa Soulieana, now 3 generations away. And from now on, instead of that name, we're just going to call it Squiggle. See that little green squiggle? Yeah. Now, as a parent, it was prolific. It gave a lot of seed. It gave a lot of pollen. And there were actually some introductions, the first being Flutterby. And Flutterby actually looks a lot like the seedling, except Flutterby has that blush to it that the seedling did not. It was a solid yellow. Now, again, the climbing habit predominated. And it was a big rampant climber with great display. A few other babies that were directly out of it, not so remarkable. Long Tall Sally, still a big plant, and that was all that jazz and squiggle. And then Bebop came from a miniature Santa Claus in squiggle. So that's the only one that had a tidy habit. Now you see too how the single petalage has dominated still in this generation. However, one that did not was Sky's the Limit, the yellow climber that's still around. It's just barely double, but it's definitely a big rampant climber. And the cross on that was the Poulsen bloodline of Princess Mariana and Squiggle. Now, as a grandparent, it was still producing climbers, all ablaze. And you'll see this Squiggle and Dortmund seedling showing up as a parent along the way. And certainly Spice So Nice, which was a great color. And there were a couple of minor introductions of climbers that were more private introductions, but again, they were related to this rose, both of them red. I almost thought Jacob's Ladder was extinct, but about 3 years ago, older gentleman came up to me and started talking about how beautiful his Jacob's Ladder was, and we grabbed propagating material immediately on it, because it was only sold for like 2 years by Edmunds. But there were 2 more compact now introductions that have come forward in this next generation. So we're 5 generations away from Rosa Soulieana. One was Out of the Blue with Stephen's Big Purple, and you'll see this International Herald Tribune times Squiggle seedling popping up as we go along here. And then the relatively forgettable Miami Moon, which did hold a nice compact habit. And that was Voodoo and Squiggle. Now then, as a great-grandparent, so we're 6 generations away at this point. Now we're starting to get less climbers. However, Night Owl is certainly up there in the climber style on its vigor. I'm sorry that this is cutting it off here. Can we adjust that a little bit on the projector? Kind of move him over. Because that's, there you see the International Herald Tribune and Squiggle. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. With Sweet Chariot, Blue Nile, and Rosy Outlook. Now, Rosy Outlook is a half-sister to 4th of July. It's Tournament of Roses and Roller Coaster. So it should have been striped, but nobody told it. Paul Leakey Jr. then also comes out of this. And there again, International Herald Tribune and Squiggle showing up. And it was really just the bloodlines of that seedling, not the characteristics it personally possessed, that led me to breed with it as a hunch. And then here came the first All-America winner, Wild Blue Yonder, again as a great-grandparent. And there's that International Herald Tribune and Squiggle. Now the group you might not expect, are my purples. So it's really unusual to get 2 introductions from one cross. To get 3 introductions from one cross is very, very rare. And this is the 3, Ebb Tide, Midnight Blue, and Route 66. Those were all in that same cross, and here's the cross. So there again, International Herald Tribune, and Sweet Chariot has been a great parent. If you look what Ralph did when he made that cross, it has so many different bloodlines in it. Polyantha, China, across the board. It's an amazing seedling. And I'm going to have a direct introduction out of it this next year, in fact. And then there is the favorite grandchild of all, Julia. Now, Julia should have been a climber. I was breeding for a large shrub or a massive yellow climber. But again, nobody told it. And here was this little round compact of a plant, but it was a great plant. And look, Summer Wine is a grandparent, and Summer Wine is a huge, massive climber. You know, and the International Herald Tribune and the Squiggle bloodline is a massive climber. Just amazing, this little dwarf thing came out of it. And almost all of its sisters were big, rampant climbers in that seedling. Now, because of Julia, this bloodline is going to go ad infinitum, because every breeder in the world glommed onto Julia Child like a hen on a June bug, and they're working with it, and they should. Now, great-grandkids and beyond, 7 generations away, at least. Now, one being Cinco de Mayo, seedling of Julia Child. Everybody thinks it comes out of hot cocoa. It doesn't. It doesn't. At Twilight Zone, the larger flowered version of Ebb Tide, and Happy Go Lucky. Now I'm bringing in some of Christian's hybrids because we were a team breeding for the same company. And Christian hit the jackpot too, not with this group. These are some minor introductions, some of them private. This one was only around for a couple of years for a promotion, but the lovely Edith's Darling, I hate those names, is now out as an introduction. Soon people will forget the TV show and not know what the hell any of that is. But this is where Christian hit the jackpot. He also has a cross where 3 introductions have come from the same parentage. And that's Jump for Joy, Doris Day, and Sparkle and Shine. I think Sparkle and Shine is his finest work. It's a fabulous rose. And that's all out of Julie Newmar and Julia Child. So Julie Newmar was Living Easy St. Patrick against Julia Child. Now further on, Grand Dame relates back to this seedling because it's Wild Blue Yonder and Meredith. Diamond Eyes, again, should have been a climber by any means, but instead the miniature habit dominated on it, and that's really about the darkest purple of yet. And this 2019 Flory, which is Julia Child in Stormy Weather, against a direct climber, still compact in habit. Oh, and the name on this one is good old W892-D1. And Julia is the mother, and it's acting a lot like Julia, but it is a soft lemon yellow that blushes orchid pink, and the fragrance will knock you down. It's fabulous fragrance. So that's coming up in 2019. So that's just the start of where we're going with some of these bloodlines. And to know that that seedling was almost lost completely, and then we found it and did what we did with it. So I think it's a cool story, and I'm happy to share it with you. Now, I have to talk about the Huntington a little bit, at least. Just like you guys, we had this fabulous rain, and everything had been so starved that the growth was beyond spectacular. Probably one of the most bedazzling displays I've ever seen in my career, and I just wanted to share some of the spring bloom shots with you guys. So that's Jump for Joy doing its thing. Hardly ever out of bloom for us.
What is it?
Jump for Joy. This is a love song, 2 trees of love song in the Shakespeare garden with the tortured pyracantha that wants to be a Christmas tree. Sparkle and Shine, I showed you already. To me, that's like the new and improved sunflower. Better color, better plant, beautiful foliage contrast. And our trellises are finished. The plants are back up. They're happy. They're growing. Just a wee bit of color. I swear the visitors would come out and just kind of start spinning in the middle of the garden, and we'd push them out of the way. Pardon? That was in April of this year, so about mid-April this year. It was rare to find that walkway without people holding cameras, snapping pictures.
And you fertilized a lot before all the rains?
Not anything out of the ordinary. I think it's just that the rains washed the salts out of the soil and gave valuable nitrogen and oxygen down into the root systems, and the plants responded. This is one of our faux bois tree planters, and it was spectacular this year. And that's Flower Girl up in the top of it, with burgundy icebergs surrounding. And that's mellow yellow, 2 plants of mellow yellow in the front. One more to talk about, this little guy right here. This is new for 2018, and this is a Healthemia, and this is directly out of Sweet Chariot with Jam Big Eye. And it is a shrub. The flowers are about that big on it, but huge clusters. They open up pink with a raspberry eye, and then they fade to lavender with a purple eye. And they're very fragrant. All those clusters in or all those colors in one cluster. It's going to get about 4.5 feet tall and about 4 feet broad with a relaxed sort of spilling habit in the garden. And that's called Easy on the Eyes. Easy on the Eyes. And then that's Neil Diamond. Let's do any questions. Yes?
How close do you plant your roses?
Too close. You know, this garden is an old garden where it gets planted higgledy-piggledy. If I was planting a new garden, I would space them out more, but they're about 2.5 feet. It's a little too close, yeah. It'd be nice to be 3 foot, but I'm not going to dig up and replant the whole garden. No way. Done.
Can you give us the history of George Burns?
The history of George Burns, okay. This seedling was from my 2nd year of breeding, and my boss at the time had thought that Spring Hill Nursery was going to save the world, and he offered them our new seedlings for a pittance, and they could name them and give them their first introduction on the market. So that's where George Burns came from. It was actually George Burns Centennial. And we refused to register the Centennial part. We stuck with George Burns, at least. And it's still a good little rose, really. It's got many good characteristics on it. Another one that Spring Hill named was Rosie O'Donnell. They unfortunately named Rosie O'Donnell. And then also Moonstone, they wanted to call Cadillac DeVille. So you'll see that in parentheses next to the Moonstone name, but Moonstone is the registered name on it. And then fortunately, we ended that relationship. So that was good. Well, good. I've talked you all to smithereens. Yes?
What is your spraying treatment program like? What do you spray for, if any, and what?
We only spray for chili thrip, and that's late in the summer. And we're just now begun that. And that's the only spraying we do. So if we get diseases, we get diseases. My thought is, if the public is out there looking and they're looking for what they might want to plant in their own garden, if they look at one plant and it's defoliated and the next plant has all of its foliage and it's clean, which one would they buy? So, we get through our diseases, but the chili thrips finally nail me. They are so prolific and so horrible in what they do. So we've done a couple of sprays of spinosad, which is registered as an organic, loosely, and it does seem to help. But we're putting out beneficials rapidly still, hoping that something might help us. Yes?
Back in the early 30s, did you have the parentage and sort of what the history of the parentage and all?
The parentage of George Burns, I don't remember it right off the top, but it's 2 named varieties. Yeah. Barbara?
Love Song and Neptune,
Yes.
gorgeous lavender, those are fragrant. I think of Love Song as a Floribunda that thinks it's an exhibition type of tea. Can you talk about the relative parentage there and the characteristics you were going for?
They're somewhat related. I know on Love Song, Memorial Day is a direct parent on it against some of the lavender bloodlines. And out came this compact plant with huge flowers and a heavy bloomer. Neptune goes back to basics again, earlier on in my lavender work. And again, I don't right off the top of my head recall the parentage on Neptune, but they are interrelated certainly in their bloodlines. Greg?
For many years I subscribed to the Rose Hybridizers Association newsletter, just because I was interested in what was being done. And there was a long conversation about the lavender breeding for lavender roses and purple roses. And what shocks me tonight is that you seem to have combined so many different purples and lavenders to create lavenders that goes against that whole argument that you had to bring in other color combinations.
And that was really a lesson from Herb Schwimm and from Sam McGrady, is to keep your bloodlines as broad as you possibly can along the way to get true difference in the offspring.
It's impressive because what you have done with purples, I think, is one of the greatest accomplishments of rose breeding in the past 100 years.
Oh wow, thank you. But it is a color breakthrough, and I was very pleased. I would love to have gotten that in the hybrid tea, but we didn't quite get there along the way. But thanks so much. Yeah, and they're fragrant, which is nice too.
Would you repeat that again? Keep the bloodlines as long as possible.
As wide as possible. So you don't. I think one of the great failings of a few of the American breeders was they kept interbreeding. They used their own lines back on their own lines, back on their own lines, back on their own lines. And you end up with a whole lot of pink when you do that. And you don't end up with very much hybrid vigor. So we're taught in genetics that if you breed from 2 broad bloodlines and cross them together, you've got a greater chance of hybrid vigor with something more vigorous than either parent and more clean than either parent and a different color than either parent. And so that was Sam's thought too, was to pick and choose bloodlines from multiple sources all over the world, combine them into your own seedlings. I mean, if Bill Warner would have analyzed his career and looked at his more successful varieties, it was the one moment he stepped out of his bloodlines and brought another one in. Yes?
Can you speak a little more about what you could share with us about the instinct you must have for being able to sense what will work? It's more than clearly a crapshoot.
It's more than a crapshoot, and it's more than just science, too. That's what I love about it. It's a nice combination of art and science. And Herb Schwimm was one to always tell me he was not a numbers man. He didn't believe the more seedling you had, the better the chance you had. He believed he should have a manageable number of seedlings and that you should really observe it. And he produced more All-America winners from no more than 80,000 seed a year than Bill Warner did with 250 to 300,000 seed a year. Because he was really there observing it, and he had a bloodhound of an eye. I mean, his favorite colors were orange and yellow bicolors, and he could walk in a seedling house and just go, and find them, just like that. So there were times we'd try to hide them actually from them, and he would find them. So he was really good that way. So a part of it is your instinct and your hunch, and your knowledge of your market, and what your company offers, and what they need to make it different. Yes?
You mentioned you get a whole lot of pink, and I had just read that pink is dominant. Can you just toss out some gems of what tends to be dominant gene-wise and what's recessive?
It kind of depends upon the variety more than an overview generally. Like, I'm surprised that Julia Child's habit is dominant. And I bred a lot with Santa Claus, the red miniature. And in that case from Santa Claus, the red was very dominant in its seedlings. The Helthemias are not. They're more recessive in their lines, but the stripes are dominant in the stripe crosses, so they show up more often than not. I think it's hard to generalize it for the whole group. It's almost by variety as to how some of these things really surface or not. One rule you can follow is if it's really, really good, it's really, really sterile. Sally Holmes, forget it. Ain't gonna get nothing off Sally Holmes at all. At all. It's probably a true triploid. No pollen, no seed with it. Yeah. So, and there are the Murphy's Laws of breeding, such as nothing will come from a parent that's really good until you throw that parent out of breeding work, and then suddenly something will show up in its offspring that's fabulous, but you just threw it out. So, Jack used to say that none of the bad characteristics show up until you put it in the trials, and then they surface. But it will humble you to see something that looks so very, very good, and you've observed it for 5 years, and you put it in the national trials, and it looks like crap everywhere else. Or you go to England and just hang your head in shame because they've dramatically changed so much from what you know them as. So like 4th of July in England is a 4-foot shrub. But yet Julia Child looks the same everywhere she goes. Everywhere she goes. And who's to predict that change? Don?
I know like Ping and his program would emphasize the fact that when you have the seedlings and stuff, he would try to make sure to in effect contaminate with mildew and everything else so it could weed out. When you were in the early days, were any of the breeders doing anything like that to, kind of put in disease so they could weed out the things that cause disease?
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, most of us were in California, so we produced some fine powdery mildew resistance, but didn't do a whole lot with black spot because it wasn't around. So we would take advantage of what was there in nature and use that against it. I would cull out thousands of baby seedlings just because they had powdery mildew on them. I didn't want to see them bloom. It was too tempting just to get them out and leave the clean ones. So yeah, it was happening, but it wasn't in the right spot. Yes, sir?
Going back to the 4th of July, I know it has a different name in England.
Yeah, crazy for you. Crazy for you.
Why is it so different? Why is it the 4th?
That's common. That's common. Mr. Lincoln is a runt in Europe.
But why? Is it the water?
No, it's a combination of genetics, it's a combination of climate. It's really hard to say. Just like a lot of the Austin roses become great rampant monsters here. And they're not in England. A lot of the Cornish roses that you're seeing now are going to get big when you bring them into a mild climate. And they tend to change some of their blooming habits too. So it's very common that they look quite different in other countries. And it's more uncommon that they don't. Yes?
Did you ever make a list of the roses that do exceptionally well in Southern California versus the ones that do exceptionally well in Northern California?
I can't say there was so much separation between the California line as there was between like the Northeast versus California, or the South versus California. With it, you guys are fairly similar to us. Now, a fine story to tell in reverse, Sally Holmes in the UK, where it was introduced, is a 5-foot shrub. And it stands upright, 5 feet tall, blooms beautifully right here.
So what is
Ballerina was part of the parentage, yeah. And that could be, because ballerina is pretty rampant.
It also have the same sort of...
Yeah, it gets much bigger here than it does there. Well, guys, I hope I didn't throw too much genetics at you, but I hope you enjoyed. Thanks.